because of this high activity in the ale yeast, this churning and this turbulence in the fermenter, you see the ale yeast actually kind of rise to the top. Hi, I'm Eric Martins, owner and founder of Brewing Company, the first brewery taproom in the Crossroads District of Kansas City, Missouri. And this is Beer 101, Lagers versus Ales. All beer comes in two major categories, lager and ale. And so no matter what beer we're talking about, it's going to land into one of these two categories, starting with lagers. Lagers are fermented with a yeast strain that is called Saccharomyces pastorianus. That's just the type of yeast that we use to produce lagers. It has some special characteristics. It likes to ferment at lower temperatures, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit is where these yeast strains like to ferment. They have a slower fermentation process at this lower temperature, and at the end of the fermentation process, they undergo something called lagering, which is where it gets its name, where the beer is brought down to even cooler temperatures, kind of refrigeration temps between 32 and 36 degrees Fahrenheit, where it can sit for up to 30 days, maybe even longer, and do some cold conditioning where the flavors are cleaning up and the beer's becoming nice and crisp. All lagers tend to lean towards the more clean flavor profile because of the nature of how the yeast ferments and the chemicals that it produces during fermentation, but Pilsner especially is a very clean version of that. And when I say clean, what I mean is during fermentation, there are often lots of esters, phenols, these chemical compounds that create different flavor profiles. And that can be good depending on the style of beer. But with lagers, typically you're trying to have very few of these chemical compounds so that you just have a beer that has an easy finish with not a lot of extra flavor imparted by the yeast. So if you're new to beer, want to try something that's just light and easy, a lager, especially a Pilsner lager, would be a good route to go. Next, let's talk about ales. Ales are a different yeast strain. That strain is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it's just a different species of yeast that has some different properties when compared to lager strains. So ale yeast strains like warmer fermentation temperatures. This can be a little bit of a wider range, but typically between 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of the warmer temperatures and a faster fermentation activity, they typically finish their fermentation process in about a week, maybe a little bit longer, depending on the beer style. So a lot of craft breweries, especially starting out, like to do more ales for this reason, because production is faster and you can make more beer and different styles of beer more quickly when compared to lagers. So ale yeasts are going to impart some more character into the beer than lager yeasts do. Oftentimes this comes through as a fruitiness that comes from chemicals called esters. It can also be phenolics. There are lots of different compounds and lots of different types of ale yeast. This is a nice, easy drinking pale ale with some hop character, but the yeast is going to impart a little additional fruity ester profile to this beer. This can look like banana or clove in the case of something like a Hefeweizen. It can be sort of apple flavors, lots of different fruit type of flavors. There's a really wide range of flavors that we can get from ale yeast, and that's exciting as a brewer because you can really change the way a beer tastes by just selecting a certain type of yeast strain. So what are esters? Well, they're simply chemical compounds that are especially produced by ale yeast. They're also actually found in fruit itself. So this is why these esters provide a fruitiness to the beer, because when you're smelling and tasting beer and you notice an apple or a banana or pineapple kind of note in it, this could be the exact same chemical compound that's in that fruit, and that's why you smell it and taste it. So how are lagers and ales different in the brewing process itself? Well, these two yeast strains behave a little differently in the fermenter. Because lagers ferment at colder temperatures and they ferment more slowly, that means that their activity is a little bit lower than ale yeast. And so what we see is this lower activity means a slower release of carbon dioxide, which is a natural part of the fermentation process, and a little less turbulence in the fermenter. So if you've heard of the terms top fermenting or bottom fermenting yeast, you may already know that lagers are a bottom fermenting yeast, and this is because of the slower activity of the yeast. Those lagers tend to sink toward the bottom of the fermenter and perform most of their activity there, whereas ale yeasts are highly active, producing a lot of CO2, a lot of turbulence, and these yeast cells tend to rise to the top of the fermenter and do most of their fermentation activity there. If you want to impress your friends and learn more about how to enjoy beer, subscribe and check out our next video on different types of ales.